Good morning. We look today at chapter 1 and 2 of the book of Titus. And as I mentioned before we began studying Timothy, Titus is one of Paul's pastoral letters. It's written very specifically in many ways to Titus, who is a follower of Paul, who is a convert. He is a non-Jew. So Titus is part of the conversation of circumcision, where some of the Jewish leaders said that, these people that are Gentiles, unless they've been circumcised, cannot be a follower of Christ. They cannot be saved because they're heathens, And so Titus is one of those that Paul used in his argument, saying that, God's love, God's grace, God's forgiveness, God's acceptance does not depend upon whether or not we are circumcised. It doesn't depend upon, da-di-da-di-da, but God's love, comes freely to all. So Titus isn't mentioned in the book of Acts at all. He's mentioned in Galatians and in 2 Corinthians specifically. He journeys with Paul to Crete, and when Paul leaves Crete, Timothy is left behind there. We'll find that out when we start looking at chapter 1 in just a couple of minutes here. But Paul has instructed Timothy, and Timothy has learned a lot from Paul, and this is the way, we all learn. But so Paul had established a church in Corinth, and Titus did go to Corinth a couple times that Paul asked him to. And Titus is responsible for healing some of the friction that was between Paul and the people of Corinth, to clearing up some of what some of the false teachers had been saying, and clearing up some of what people had been saying about Paul to smear his reputation, his integrity. People were undermining Paul in many ways, and Titus was very instrumental in repairing that relationship between Paul and the church in Corinth. Titus is 3 chapters, and the first chapter talks a lot about the structuring of the church, like the bishop, and in a way, I almost sense that Paul is talking about Titus as one of the bishops, but the bishops and the elders, and chapter 2 talks about the older men, the older women, the younger men, the younger women, the slaves, the different peoples that make up the church, the different groups, how they divide themselves, and how the elders should be good examples. Young people should be supportive of the elders and learning from the elders, and it reflects an awful lot of what Paul wrote to Timothy, but in a pastoral letter instructing a younger person, or a person younger in faith anyway, maybe encouraging them. It only makes sense that there would be much of the same things in these 2 letters. The 3rd chapter talks about life in the church, the responsibility of believers to live as good citizens, to be not just laying around waiting for the resurrection or for the second coming or anything, but to be a good citizen. And I don't know if I've really said that too much on one of these morning studies, but I know in different worship services I've said that one of the responsibilities of a Christian, or one of the aspects of a Christian, the character trait of a Christian, is not only to be the very best and faithful to God, but to be a good citizen of the country in which you reside. You vote, you take part in activities, you follow the laws of the land to the best of your ability. You're not out to subvert the government, but within that as well, you are, as a Christian, we point out we cautiously point out other people's sins, or we reprove them, and within our citizenship to our country, we too, as Christians, speak out against the injustices of what's going on in our world and in our government as well. So it's it's we as Christians, we encourage people to avoid hatred, to not argue, but to be, these fruits of the Spirit, gentle, meek, be courteous as possible, and encouraging others in so many ways. So looking at Titus 1 and 2, it's not a very long letter, not a long book, but it begins again with, Paul saying, Paul, a servant of God, and, he teaches in accordance with the godliness in the hope of eternal life that God, and then parentheses, who never lies. Think about it. God never lies. What we read in the Bible when we hear what God says to Moses, to Abraham, to the prophets, and says, the prophet, like God said, write this, for these words are true. God never lies. And when we hear Jesus' words that we are welcome, that we are forgiven, that that you are my children, that he says, I am the good shepherd. I mean, I am God never lies. Think about that. I mean, we can trust God 100%. Who do you know in the world that you can trust 100%? It's just, that's the reality. I mean, any one of us is living in this world is fallible. I mean, we all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's what Paul writes in another place in Romans. But Paul, or God, revealed the Word. He revealed Jesus. He revealed salvation to us. And then verse 5 says, Paul writes, I left you, Titus, behind in Crete for this reason, so that what? You should put in order what remained to be done. That he would appoint these elders in every town. And he says, I directed you. Now listen to this. I directed you, Titus, someone who is blameless, married only once, whose children are believers. You're not accused of debauchery or rebellion. I appointed you. And he lists Titus's good characteristics. He's saying, you are a man of character. You're upstanding, you're believable. And then he says, for a bishop, as God's steward, must be blameless. He can't be arrogant or, and so he's saying, that as leaders in the church, we need to conduct ourselves in the very best way possible. And we can try. We do our best to do that. But as I said, we are all sinners and we fall short of the glory of God. And we all mess up as pastors, as Sunday school teachers, as school teachers, as whatever profession we are. And especially, too, we mess up as parents. And that was, when I was thinking about, when I mentioned that, who can we trust in the world? Who could we say never lies? Who can we trust 100%? I mean, I'd like to be able to say mom and dad. And mom and dad would never steer me wrong. But yet, they were sinners too. But yet they did the best they can. And I hope, I know that as a parent and as a grandparent, I like to tease. I like to, maybe do some things I maybe shouldn't sometimes. And just, you see this T-shirt that kind of says, anything I do, I can blame on Grandpa, or, something to that effect. That's kind of true about me sometimes. But yet, within that teasing, within that, some of that we're not trying to lead them astray. We're not trying to get them to do wrong things, but it's the sense of humor. It's to look at things in a different light and in a different manner. But yet we need to be careful in those things. Very careful in those things. He says Paul says there are many who are rebellious, idle talkers and deceivers. And then he says, especially those of the circumcision. And that's why, I mentioned about Titus. Titus was a Gentile. He was not a Jew. He was not circumcised. And people were saying, he's got to be circumcised. He's got to follow the laws of the Jewish before God can love him. No. No. One of the qualifications of being a Christian is not to be a Jew first, or not to be just like the Jews first. To be a Christian is to believe in God, to believe in Jesus as Lord and Savior. And He says those evil talkers must be silenced. And then in verse 12, he writes, it was one of them, their very own prophet, who said, Cretans are always liars, vicious brutes, and lazy gluttons. Yeah. This is so true. I mean, Cretans, we could say people from whatever town. And I've had people, when I had a person from one community say to me, are those people in that community treating you okay? Or you got to be really careful when you go down to such a community, because you can't trust those people for anything. You got to watch yourself all the time. And so here it is. Those Cretans are liars, vicious brutes, lazy gluttons. We have, for whatever, we have those impressions. And I remember growing up, the rivalries that we had between communities and different things that way. But, wherever you go, there are really, really good people. There's some bad ones too. There are. But, you can't put everybody in one class. And even though in verse 13, Paul says that testimony is true. The Cretans are lazy brutes and liars and lazy, and Paul says that's true. Well, no, it wasn't true about all of them, because they established a church, many churches in Crete, and become very, very, very loyal and followers in Crete. And so we need to be open-minded and know that, we are all no better than the other. Chapter 2, he talks again here now about teaching. He says, teach what is consistent with sound doctrine. And I talked about that some yesterday in my sermon, and, teaching sound doctrine, remaining rooted in the world. He says, and then he talks about the older men, the older women, younger men, younger women, and how we live and everything. And in all of that, he says, show yourself in all respects a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity, gravity, and sound speech. And what better way to show God's love by living that way? I'm going to wrap up with verse 11. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all. Bringing salvation to all. And this is what the church teaches. This is what Christianity teaches. Salvation is for all. Even though Jesus said, I come to give my life for many, and he says that because he knows that not all are going to believe. But Christianity is for all. It's for you. God's blessings today as always.